Thanks very much to all of you for being here today, and happy end of semester. It's our pleasure to introduce Miko Jimenez. Liba and I co-advised Miko for his master's degree, and today he's going to be sharing the results of his research on the effectiveness of urban conservation programs for engaging the public and enhancing habitat for wildlife species. Miko grew up outside of Chicago and received his bachelor's degree in biology from Knox College. As an undergraduate student, he was the founder and president of his college's ornithology club. And prior to joining us here at CSU, Miko worked for the Urban Wildlife Institute at the Lincoln Park Zoo, where he monitored urban wildlife, as well as for the Nature Conservancy on native prairie restoration. These experiences provided an excellent foundation for collaborating with the city of Fort Collins on his master's research.
So Miko's ambitious project, which you're about to hear about, crosses disciplinary boundaries. It occurs largely on private land. It includes a wide variety of species and has real implications for land use planning and public engagement in science. Miko's received several research fellowships and awards to support his research, and I'm also really pleased to share that in collaboration with other graduate students, he's also co-lead on an article reporting the outcomes of a nationwide survey on diversity and inclusion in our discipline, Ecology and Evolution, which was recently accepted to Nature, Ecology and Evolution, his first peer-reviewed publication in a Nature journal, which is awesome. Miko's been such a pleasure and an honor to work with for both Sarah and I. He's thoughtful, he's curious, and his enthusiasm is infectious when it comes to both nature and people. We have no doubt that Miko has a super bright future as an ecologist with a strong commitment to partnering with the public to advance conservation science and practice in cities and beyond. So please welcome Miko.
Thank you, Liba and Sarah, for such a thoughtful and kind introduction, and thank you all for coming today. It really is, a pleasure to see so many familiar faces here today, and I really appreciate it. So thanks for coming. And I'm going to be talking about this research project that I've been working on for the past 2.5 years. So we live in an urbanizing world. Most people today in the world live in a city, and about 54%, and that number is increasing. And expected to hit 66% by the year 2050. So more and more people are living in an urban environment, and that leads to a number of challenges for us as conservationists. Ecologically, we know that urban development tends to fragment or degrade habitats. This is a picture of Central Park in Manhattan in New York City, which is one of the most urban environments that you can think of. And you can see just how fragmented this landscape is, and you can imagine all the ecological effects that has for wildlife and the implications there ecologically. But something I think that we often overlook are the social repercussions of urbanization. So we know that urban residents often have less access to green space, and this is important for a number of reasons. One, there are a number of health and social benefits that are associated with having access to green space. But also as a conservation community, we can't really expect residents or people to value something that they don't interact with. So we might expect that because people have less access to green space, that might lead to some challenges with garnering public support for conservation initiatives. So a lot of my research is focused around this central question of how can we best engage a growing urban public in conservation to achieve both ecological and social benefits. So I'll come back to this a lot, but this is kind of the overarching question for a lot of my research. So in response to a lot of urbanization, there's some big conservation players have set up these urban conservation programs, and I'm going to broadly define those here today as just programs that look to engage the urban public in conservation initiatives. So we have examples like the Nature Conservancy setting up their cities network a couple of years ago, so focusing on kind of urban conservation and engaging urban citizens. We have examples like the Audubon Society trying to engage a lot of urban constituents in bird conservation. And we even have examples like government agencies. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife even recognizes that urban conservation is something that they need to focus some of their efforts on. So a lot of big conservation players have kind of set up these urban conservation programs. And I'm going to be talking about two specific types of programs today. First, I'm going to talk about citizen science programs. So citizen science is a method for conducting research that enlists the public to collect scientific data. And a lot of you may be familiar with some of these programs like iNaturalist or eBird, which are some of those bigger programs. But there are also a number of smaller, more local programs that focus specifically on engaging a growing urban public. And then the second type of program that I'm going to be talking about today are urban habitat enhancement programs. And these are programs that look to provide wildlife with habitat within the urban matrix. So these are things like your pollinator gardens or bird-friendly gardens. A really good example locally is the Habitat Heroes program, which is run by the Audubon Rockies here along the Front Range. And that program looks to basically provide birds with habitat along the Front Range here in a very rapidly urbanizing area. So those are the two types of urban conservation programs I'm going to be talking about today. And given that a lot of these programs are new or have at least taken on new roles in light of conservation, there are a number of emerging questions that we have about both of them. So, in terms of citizen science, there are questions about data quality, and are there potential trade-offs when we collect data using citizen science as opposed to professional scientists or trained technicians? Secondly, are there benefits? Why are we doing this? Are there benefits to engaging the public? And in particular, what are those benefits? Can they be quantified? And why do they matter to us as conservationists? And then in regard to urban habitat enhancement programs, we have questions regarding how effective are they at engaging residents, and can residents be effective stewards for providing habitat for native wildlife? And then further, there's a question about if, a lot of these programs focus on providing native plants or native vegetation within private lands. And there's a question about if those, if you plant a native garden, do those benefits extend to other wildlife species like birds and butterflies? So does that actually work in practice? So given that those emerging questions, I developed two research questions for both of these programs. Regarding citizen science, I asked the question of, are there trade-offs associated with collecting data using technicians as opposed to trained technicians or professional scientists? And then in regard to urban habitat enhancement programs, I asked the question of essentially how effective are these programs at providing habitat for native species. So I'll be coming back a lot to these research questions just to remind you of what I'm asking about both of these programs that I'm going to talk about. And I want to say, I did all of my research locally, and Colorado rather, is probably one of the best places to ask some of these questions. It's one of the fastest growing states in the country. In particular, the place where we live, the Front Range, is the fastest growing region in the state. So it's a quickly urbanizing area. And just to kind of illustrate that point, this is a picture of Fort Collins that I found in the CSU archives in 1937. You can see there are definitely some major roads. There's some development. But this is a very different picture if we compare it to Fort Collins in 2018, which, there's a lot more impervious surface, a lot more buildings, building density is a lot higher. So, this is all just to get the point across that Fort Collins is growing really rapidly. And on a more anecdotal note, my mom went to college in Wyoming in the 80s. So I just asked her, what was your perception of Fort Collins in the 80s? And her answer was, there wasn't even a Walmart yet. There were some restaurants and boutique stores, but what I want to draw attention to is this: there was only one brewery, which I think is kind of crazy to think about, and also illustrates this point of how quickly Fort Collins has grown. And so in response to a lot of that growth, the city of Fort Collins has set up this Nature in the City initiative. And this initiative looks, it's, like I said, a strategic response to a lot of the growth here in Fort Collins. And the specific vision for the program is a connected open space network accessible to the entire community that provides a variety of experiences and functional habitat for people, plants, and wildlife. And this is a really cool initiative with very lofty and I think progressive goals for conservation. And what I really want to highlight here is this people, plants, and wildlife piece, because this shows, us as conservationists that the city is really, it recognizes, one, that there are both ecological and social challenges associated with development, and also more pointedly that not all green spaces can serve exactly the same purpose. So some specific goals that the initiative looks to accomplish are making sure that every resident is within a 10-minute walking distance to nature. So this is very important because we know that in a lot of developed cities, urban green space is not equally spread throughout the city, and this leads to a lot of communities not having access to green space. So this is something that the initiative really looks to combat and I guess address. And so that's one specific goal. More ecologically, the initiative looks to provide a connected habitat network across the city of Fort Collins. So we know from a lot of the literature that if wildlife can move around a city, they're much more likely to persist and adapt to changes. So this is an important thing ecologically to allow wildlife to adapt. And then lastly, the initiative looks to focus on land stewardship. So changing the landscape of Fort Collins to something that more closely resembles a native habitat, which in this case is shortgrass prairie. So these are the specific goals of the initiative, and associated with the initiative and in trying to achieve some of these goals, there are a number of different projects that are associated with the overall initiative. And today I'm going to be focusing on assessing two different projects. One is the Biodiversity Project, and one is the Certified Natural Areas Program. So first I'm going to talk about the Biodiversity Project, which is a citizen science monitoring program. And just as a reminder, my research question regarding these types of programs is, are there trade-offs associated with monitoring with citizen scientists as opposed to trained technicians? So I want you to imagine for a second that you're an institution that is looking to monitor wildlife species locally, and more specifically, you're potentially interested in implementing a citizen science program. The potential benefits are going to be, if you implement a citizen science program, there's some potentially benefits for public engagement in conservation, so that's good, website material, but also good for creating connections with the community and within the community. So those are huge benefits locally. But then if you ask a lot of scientists, and in particular in some of the peer-reviewed literature, they might suggest that there might be some problems with data quality, and that the data that is collected by citizen scientists might not be as usable to apply to making decisions. And then there's this added component of cost effectiveness. And what I mean by this is, per paid dollar that goes into a program, how much research output are you getting out? So how many surveys and how many detections are you getting for your dollar if you put it into each of these programs? So ultimately, as an institution, you're going to weigh these costs and benefits. And depending on your goal, if your goal really is public engagement, then you're going to weigh those benefits more heavily. Whereas if your goal is really precise data collection, and you want to use these data for making decisions, you might weigh those costs more heavily. The problem with this framework, though, is that most of these costs and benefits aren't often quantified. So it's really hard to make these types of decisions for institutions. And so we really set out for this project to quantify some of those costs and benefits to help build a framework that is helpful for these institutions to make these decisions. So to quantify these costs and benefits, we assessed the Nature in the City Biodiversity Project, which again is a citizen science monitoring program. And the goals of the program are to monitor birds and butterflies across the city of Fort Collins with a combination of both citizen scientists and technicians. And ultimately, the city wants to use these data to identify high-quality habitat patches through occupancy modeling, and ultimately identify areas where habitat connectivity can be protected or restored. So these are the goals of the program, and we were looking to compare these programs on the basis of data quality, and we predicted that technicians would have potentially higher data quality or at least less variable data, whereas the citizen science model would be potentially more cost effective, and the public engagement piece would be a little bigger with the citizen science model. So So these were our predictions. We ran both of these programs in parallel in 2018. So I'm just going to walk through exactly how that worked and what that entailed. So around this time, at the beginning of every summer, we recruit a team of citizen scientists. Some of you may have seen this poster up around Wagar, around campus. And we hire a team of technicians. And so, yeah, we recruit our citizen scientists and we hire our paid technicians. Before the program begins, we give our citizen scientists a pre-program survey, which assesses some different things, like their ability to identify local birds and butterflies. It assesses their self-efficacy for environmental action. So this is a measure of an individual's perception of how they can, combat or deal with environmental issues. And then it also addresses nature relatedness. So this is a measure of how connected an individual feels to their local green spaces or green spaces in general. So before the program begins, we give our citizen scientists that pre-program survey, and then we train both our citizen scientists and our technicians. And for our citizen scientists, we have classroom training where we teach them a little bit about the initiative that they're working for, and also we start teaching them how to identify different bird and butterfly species. And then for both our citizen scientists and our technicians, we have in-field training. So we actually go out and we conduct a bird point count with them, and we conduct a butterfly pollard walk with them, and we teach them how to collect these data in the field. So I should say for our citizen scientists, in order to not overwhelm them and so that they don't have to learn all the birds in Fort Collins, which would be, ideally or overwhelming for someone who doesn't already know their birds, we give them indicator species. So these are 15 bird indicator species, which were selected to be relatively common, relatively easy to identify, and I think most importantly, they tell us a little bit about the community or the habitat that we're looking at. So for example, if we see some of our human-sensitive species, so things like yellow warblers or song sparrows or western meadowlarks, these species, as their name suggests, might be sensitive to human development. And so if we see them in a habitat, we might think that that habitat or that community is relatively intact and that habitat is not as disturbed. Relative to if we see a lot of human-adapted species, so things like house finches or grackles, these species are really well adapted to human development, and we might suspect that the habitat that we're looking at might be more disturbed or developed on. So we have 15 bird indicator species that we teach our citizen scientists to identify, and then we have 10 butterfly species which we teach our citizen scientists to identify. And with human-sensitive species being things like monarchs, a number of different blues, and some different skippers. And with our human-adapted species being things like cabbage whites or different sulfur species. So we train both our technicians and our citizen scientists, and then we have them go out and they monitor these bird and butterfly species at different places in the city. And so for birds, we collect data using point counts. So these are pretty standard, 5-minute point counts around a 50-meter radius, and you just count all the birds that you see. And for butterflies, we use pollard walks, which are basically you walk along a transect and you're looking for butterflies on 6 meters on either side of you for 50 meters. So we do this at 168 sites throughout the city of Fort Collins. These sites were selected to be stratified or spatially balanced across the city, and also stratified across 9 different land use types. And I think one of the benefits of doing all my research locally is that you guys are probably all familiar with a lot of the places where I'm surveying. So for example, we survey natural areas, and one of our sites is on Maxwell Natural Area, which is only a couple hundred feet away from the A, which is visible from campus, and I think even from this room kind of. So we survey there. We also survey at the CSU Trial Garden, which we consider an urban ag site and is just southeast of campus, only a couple blocks away from here. And we also survey at, we have a site that's just outside Odell Brewery, and it's just near the parking lot there. There's this little small patch of green space. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that we consider a lot of different things green space, and we consider a lot of different ways that land uses could be potentially used as habitat for wildlife species. So we monitor all the sites, and then once we're done monitoring, we give our volunteers a post-program survey, which addresses all of the things that the pre-program survey addressed, and in addition, it addresses behavioral intentions to engage in conservation actions. So this is a measure of how interested volunteers were in engaging in conservation as a result of being part of the program. So that's how we run both of the programs in parallel. And then ultimately what we're left with is two data sets, one collected by citizen scientists and one collected by technicians, and also a pre-program survey and a post-program survey. And again, we use all of these data to assess data quality between our two different programs, cost effectiveness between our two different programs, and public engagement. So moving on to some of my results. In terms of data quality, we used a false positive occupancy modeling framework to compare across detection histories between citizen scientists and technicians. This framework assumes that one collection method is a certain method and one is an uncertain method. So for our purposes, we assumed that technicians were a certain method of detection, whereas citizen scientists were an uncertain method of detection. And what this framework is useful for pointing out is instances when our citizen scientists detected a species at a site where technicians didn't. And in this case, we would call that a false positive, or we would assume that citizen scientists are falsely reporting a species at a site. So ultimately, what this framework estimates for us is the probability that if a given species is present at a site, it gives us the probability that a citizen scientist will properly detect or truly detect that species, and the probability that a technician will detect that species, again, given that it's present at a site. So if we map these, or if we plot these probabilities, so on the x-axis here, we have the probability of a true detection for both a citizen scientist and a technician. And then on the y-axis here, we have bird species sorted from most common human house finch to our least common species, house wren. And if we look at the differences in the probability of a true detection for our human adapted species, and we see that for a lot of them, they're relatively similar, and that these probabilities are, at least in some cases, overlapping, or at least very relatively similar for both citizen scientists and technicians. Whereas if we look at our human sensitive species, and I recognize here that house wren is kind of an outlier here, but for the most part, if we look at our human sensitive species, we see that technicians are substantially more likely to detect those species if they're present. So what this means to me is that citizen scientists are less likely to detect human sensitive species given that they're present at a site. So this is for birds. If we move on to talking about butterflies, and we look at, so similar plot, butterflies on the y-axis, the probability of true detection on the x-axis. And if we compare between our citizen scientists and our technicians for our most common species, which is a cabbage white, we see again that there's a lot of overlap between our citizen scientists and technicians' probability of detecting this species. However, if we look at our human sensitive species, we see again that our technicians are more likely to detect this species given that it's present. So this is a similar trend that we see for butterflies, that citizen scientists are less likely to detect a human sensitive species given that it's present. So clearly there are some differences within these two data sets, but then the question that we asked next was, how does this ultimately affect the information that the city gets? And to assess that, we use single season occupancy models, and we ran each of our data sets for both citizen scientists and technicians through those single season occupancy models. And we looked at the estimations of habitat use that each model predicted or estimated. So here again we have on the y-axis, this is for both birds and butterflies, we have our most common species, cabbage whites, down to our least common species, western meadowlarks. And we see that for our most common species, which are human adapted, again, these estimates of habitat use are relatively similar. There's a good amount of overlap. Whereas when we look at some of our human sensitive species, the habitat use estimates were actually higher for citizen scientists, where when using citizen science data, and also notably, it's a lot more variable when using citizen science data. So these habitat use estimates are slightly different when using citizen science data. So again, estimates of habitat use were most similar for human adapted species between the two detection methods. So this is all presence absence data, but then we also wanted to ask the question of, are our citizen scientists, in terms of abundance, are they seeing more individuals when they go out and conduct surveys? So to look at this, we plotted the mean number of detections per survey here on the y-axis. And we compare this between citizen scientists and technicians for both human-sensitive species and human-adapted species. So again, this is just how many individuals are our citizen scientists and technicians reporting when they go out and collect these surveys. And it looks relatively similar. These values look relatively similar for human-sensitive species. However, if we look at human-adapted species, we see that citizen scientists are reporting, higher numbers, significantly higher numbers of human-adapted species. So citizen scientists tended to report higher numbers of human-adapted species, which leads us to believe that that potentially means that our citizen scientists are over-reporting the number of individuals that they're seeing at a given survey. So that's what I found with data quality. If I move on to cost effectiveness, so again, this is looking to measure the amount of research output that you get for paid dollar that goes into each program. And so here on the y-axis, we have the surveys produced per work hour and the detections produced per work hour for both programs and for both birds and butterflies. And basically what you see here across the board is that the citizen science model produced both more surveys and more detections per paid work hour. And I know that I just got done saying that it's very possible that our citizen scientists are over-reporting the number of detections or the number of individuals that they're seeing. So these detection values may be inflated as a result of that. But it's also important to note that they were still producing more surveys per work hour. So the citizen science model produced more surveys and detections per paid work hour. And then lastly, if we move on to the public engagement piece, if we're looking at ecological knowledge, so here we have mean scores out of 5 for volunteers' ability to identify birds and butterflies both before the program started and after the program. And we see that there were significant increases for both birds and particularly for butterflies in volunteer ability to identify these local species. So this suggests that the program is fairly effective at increasing volunteer ability to identify local bird and butterfly species, which is really cool. And then if we look at conservation attitudes, so it's a very similar plot here with a mean score out of 5 for both nature relatedness and self-efficacy for environmental action, both before and after the program. We see that these values didn't really change didn't change significantly, at least between between the pre-program survey and between the post-program survey. So we didn't detect any significant changes in conservation attitudes. But something that's important to note here is that a lot of these scores for the pre-program survey are already pretty high. So we suspect that a lot of our volunteers were coming in with really positive attitudes towards conservation. And that's probably a big reason why we didn't see a huge change in these attitudes. So lastly, to look at behavioral intentions to engage in conservation. To assess some of these, so on the y-axis here you have 11 different conservation actions, and on the x-axis you have the mean percentage of respondents that reported an increased interest in engaging in this action. And to get a kind of baseline for how to compare some of these values, we used what's called a dummy question. So in this case, our dummy question was reduce my ecological footprint. And this is an action that our program didn't directly address, so we don't expect that that a volunteer would necessarily exhibit an increased interest in this conservation behavior. So basically what this means for you guys is that we use this as a baseline. So if these bars don't overlap with the reduce my ecological footprint value, then we'd consider that a significant increase. So we see that a particularly high proportion of our respondents reported an increased interest in spending time observing wildlife and seeking additional information about birds and butterflies. However, we didn't see a significant increase in the proportion of volunteers that expressed an increased interest in protecting or restoring wildlife habitat on their own property or contributing to a wildlife organization. We saw an increased interest in some conservation activities, but not all. So our key findings for this program were essentially that there were more differences between the citizen science and technician data for human-sensitive species. Citizen science models produced more surveys per work hour and more detections per work hour. And lastly, that the program was effective at teaching volunteers how to identify birds and butterflies locally, but was not as effective at changing conservation attitudes. And again, that's likely due to a lot of our volunteers coming in with particularly pro-conservation attitudes. So now I'm going to switch over to the Certified Natural Areas program, which is an urban habitat enhancement program. And just as a reminder, my question regarding this program was how effective is urban habitat enhancement for providing habitat for native species? And the Certified Natural Areas program's goal is to protect, restore, and enhance native animal and plant communities on private land. A lot of the participants in this program are homeowners associations, so about 66% of sites that are enrolled in this program are on homeowners associations. And the goal of the program is really to recruit residents as stewards of, of the land. So my research goals were really to see how or if this program influences native vegetation, if the program extends those benefits to both birds and butterfly communities, and then also looking at the relative contribution of both site and landscape level factors. So are birds and butterflies responding to site level factors, or is it more if they respond to a landscape level? So to make these assessments, I used only the technician data, so I only used the technician program to make these assessments, which means I excluded all the citizen science data. And my team of technicians and I surveyed 32 sites across 3 different land use types. So our 3 different land use types were private open spaces. These were sites that were privately owned and managed on homeowners associations. And these sites, key distinction here is that they were not enrolled in the Certified Natural Areas program. As opposed to our private natural areas, which were privately owned, privately managed on homeowners associations. However, these sites were not enrolled in the Certified Natural Areas program. And then lastly, we surveyed 12 public natural areas. So these are sites that were city-owned, city-managed, and they were open to public recreation. So these were, these are sites like Maxwell Natural Area or Dixon Reservoir, some sites that you might be familiar with around town. And specifically, we looked at vegetation, we looked at bird communities using point counts, and butterfly communities using pollard walks. And a key distinction here is that we were not limited to the indicator species because we were using technician data. So we were looking at all bird and butterfly species. And in terms of vegetation, we had transects that ran through these sites, and we were looking at things like floral activity throughout the season, native plant richness at a given site, percent native cover at a given site, and then also we visually estimated the percentage of mowed vegetation. So we hypothesized that public natural areas in terms of plants would have the highest native richness and native cover, whereas private open spaces would have the least amount of cover and richness for native plants, and that private natural areas, which were enrolled in the Certified Natural Areas program, would fall somewhere in the middle. We predicted a similar thing for both birds and butterflies, that native species would be highest in public natural areas and lowest at private open spaces. And then lastly, we predicted that birds would respond more to landscape level factors, whereas butterflies would respond mostly to site level factors. So to denote what I'm talking about with my results here, I'm going to use these pictures, which will be up in the right-hand corner. So if you see any of these pictures, it'll denote if I'm talking about vegetation, birds, or butterflies. So here we have the percentage of native plants at a given site, and we compared this across our 3 different site types. And something that's really notable is that it's very variable, particularly for private natural areas and and public natural areas. And we do see, a slight trend in that would support our hypotheses, but none of these trends were statistically significant. So we also if we plot this species richness of native plants across our 3 different site types, we see a similar thing. There's a slight trend for public natural areas to have higher richness than private natural areas, and private natural areas to have higher richness than private open spaces. However, these trends were not statistically significant, so we didn't see a huge effect of site type on native plant richness or cover. However, if we look at the percentage of mowed vegetation, so this is the percentage of mowed vegetation on the y-axis plotted across our 3 different site types, we see that private open spaces, which were not in the program, had significantly higher levels of mowed vegetation than either of our other 2 site types. So what this looks like is, here's a private open space on the left-hand side and a private natural area on the right, which is enrolled in the program, and you can see it's a lot less kept, and it's not mowed down. So this suggests that the program is somewhat successful, at least in reducing the amount of mowed vegetation at a given site. If we move on to birds and look at the bird species richness between our 3 different site types, we can see again that there's definitely a slight trend. However, this trend was not significant. So we didn't see a huge effect of site type on bird species richness. However, if we look at bird community composition, so what did those bird communities actually look like at these 3 different sites, we see that, so this is the proportion of human-sensitive detections out of the total number of detections plotted across our 3 different site types. And we see that at our private natural areas, we detected more human-sensitive species than at our private open spaces. And again, these are birds like your song sparrows or western meadowlarks. So this suggests that the program provides some habitat for human-sensitive species. And if we break that down even further into what type of human-sensitive species are really using this habitat, we looked at ground nesting species across our 3 different site types, and so this is the proportion of ground nesting species detections out of our total number of detections, and we see that there's significantly more ground nesting species at our private natural areas, and that proportion is similar to what we see at some of our public natural areas. And so these are species like spotted towhees, horned larks, and killdeers that we're seeing at some of our private natural areas. So then if we move on to our butterfly communities, and we look at butterfly richness here plotted on the y-axis across our 3 different site types, the big story with butterflies is that they're highly variable across our different site types and across our different years. So we didn't see a significant effect of site type on butterfly richness across our different sites. And then if we look again at our butterfly community composition across our 3 different site types. So again, this is the proportion of human-sensitive detections across our 3 different sites, and we did not see a significant effect of site type on the proportion of human-sensitive species that we saw at our different sites. So we didn't see huge effects on the butterfly communities, but then we wanted to ask this question of what are the relative contributions of site versus landscape level factors for driving butterfly and bird communities. So to do this, we built regression models with both site and landscape level predictor variables. So specifically, we built multiple regressions with species richness as a function of each of these site and landscape level variables, and beta regression models with the proportion of human-sensitive species and the proportion of native species as a function of both, again, site level and landscape level predictor variables. And we used a stepwise approach to building these models. So we built univariate models to assess what the best scale was for to assess these relationships between landscape and these bird and butterfly communities. And ultimately, we used AICC to select the model of best support here. So here we have plotted the number of top models which include each of these covariates, both at the site level and at the landscape level. So this is just for birds, and we're looking at which of these variables was important for driving bird communities. And basically what we see here is that there's both a mix of site-level covariates and landscape-level covariates. So things like percentage of mowed vegetation was important for bird communities, but also things like building cover and grass and shrub cover were important for bird communities. So birds are responding to a mix of both site and landscape level. And if we look at what the effect size for some of these, these covariates were, here we have plotted the standardized coefficients for each of these covariates for each of these response variables here. And we see that the percentage of mowed vegetation was negatively correlated with the richness that we saw for birds. So that means is that if there's more mowed vegetation, you're likely to see less bird species at a given site. And then we also found that building cover was negatively correlated with the richness of species that we detected for birds and the proportion of human-sensitive bird species. So building cover was also something that drove some of what we saw and drove bird communities across the Fort Collins landscape. And then if we look at the same thing for butterflies, so again, this is the number of top models, which included these site-level covariates and landscape-level covariates. We see that all of the top models for butterflies that had significant relationships were at the site level. So things like site area, native cover, the percentage of mowed vegetation. And then again, if we look at how big were these effect sizes, so butterflies are responding to mostly site-level factors. And then if we look at the effect sizes for some of these covariates, so here again we have the standardized coefficients plotted for each of these covariates for each of these response variables. And the one that I want to point out is this positive relationship between native cover and butterfly species richness. So this suggests that native cover is associated with more butterfly species. So butterflies are responding to site-level covariates and in particular potentially to native cover. So our key findings for this program were that the Certified Natural Areas program reduced the amount of mowed vegetation. We detected more human-sensitive species for birds at private natural areas. And lastly, that birds respond to a mix of both site and landscape level variables, whereas we found that butterflies seem to be more influenced, in this case, to site level variables. So I think one of the cool things about working with the city directly is that all of our findings have kind of direct management implications. So, we spent this past 2 years assessing these two programs, and ultimately all of our findings have, again, like direct recommendations for these programs. So in particular, we found with the biodiversity project that citizen scientists had some challenges detecting human-sensitive species, and we also found that citizen scientists tended to over-report potentially the number of individuals that they were seeing of human-adapted species. And I think that both of these problems can potentially be addressed through training. So if we can kind of train our volunteers to be able to, teach them maybe how to identify or detect these human-sensitive species, or potentially how to track individuals throughout a survey, that might reduce some of these potential errors. And I also think that these are things that we can address through things like group birding outings or group wildlife viewing outings. So these have, these are fixable problems, is what I'm trying to get across. And then also we found that there was difficulty changing conservation attitudes, particularly because a lot of our volunteers came in with pro-conservation attitudes. So what I would suggest there is recruiting from a broader segment of the population and potentially getting volunteers who don't already have these predetermined positive attitudes towards conservation, so that we can look to kind of increase some of those attitudes across our volunteer base. And then in regard to the Certified Natural Areas program, again, some of our findings have direct management implications for how we might change some of the aspects of these different this program. We had some challenges increasing native cover and native richness. So what I'd suggest there is providing landowners with some incentive or potentially some enforcement to motivate landowners to plant native species and maintain those native species, and also potentially providing them with some resources for how to do that, and some resources for actually doing that on the ground. And then lastly, we found that birds responded to both a mix of site and landscape level factors. And what I would suggest there is that potentially the program could focus on clustering sites to affect larger swaths of habitat across the landscape in Fort Collins. So then I want to get back to, lastly, I want to get back to this, overarching question, which was kind of the driving question behind a lot of this research. So how can we best engage a growing urban public in conservation to reap the benefits both for ecologically and socially? I spent the last couple months, if not a year, analyzing these data, producing these results, writing my paper, putting together this presentation for you guys today, only to realize that a lot of the experiences that I found most powerful about this process don't lend themselves to being communicated in this way. I saw a lot of my volunteers identify their first bird, and I know that that is something that seems small or trivial, and I know it's easy to forget this after hours of looking at R, but that's why a lot of us are here. That's how a lot of us got here, and that's how I got here. And it's a really powerful experience. I deal with one landowner who, he's the president of his HOA, and his HOA is part of the Certified Natural Areas program. And he's a US veteran, and he tells me all the time that his new war is fighting for us for conservation. And the point being, I think we often underestimate how much of the public is on our side, and how much public support we have. And I think my research highlights some of the challenges in integrating that public support, but I also hope that it highlights a lot of the benefits in involving the public in the work that we do. And I definitely think that some of these urban conservation programs are not perfect, but I do think that they can play a role in what we do, and I think we should think of them as another tool in our tool belt as conservationists. Because ultimately, conservation has to be a communal effort. So with that, there are a number of people that I want to thank here today. First and foremost, I want to thank both Dr. Liba Pechar and Dr. Sarah Reed, my advisors. Someone told me to go back the day before my defense to go back and read my first proposal, which I did. And oh my gosh, I've come a really long way, and both as a researcher and a person, and I have you guys to thank for a lot of that, so thank you. I want to thank my committee member, Dr. Melissa McHale, who's here today. I want to thank the Reed Lab members and Liba Lab members, both past, present, and honorary. Grad school is a funny time because you get here, you meet a lot of people, then you put your head down to work and you look up and half those people are gone that you met. So I want to really highlight that there were a lot of Liba Lab members and Reed members who aren't here today who I want to thank. I want to thank the department, FWCB, Kim, you've helped me with everything. You're the backbone of the department. I really appreciate all the help that you've provided to me. Anne and Justin, I've learned so much about how to communicate science through you guys, and I've really enjoyed being your guys' TA. Larissa and Erica, thank you both so much. There are a number of faculty members who helped me, but I think you guys really went above and beyond. Larissa, I think I was in your office hours more than some of your students this semester, and Erica actually came out with me in the field and helped me develop some of my field methods. I want to thank the City of Fort Collins Natural Areas Department, and in particular Allison Mitchell, who helped me run this program. I want to thank all my citizen scientists. Some of you are in this room, and I really appreciate, this program wouldn't have existed without you guys. And I want to thank all of the landowners who I worked with. And then lastly, I want to thank, my funders and collaborators. I want to thank my fellow grad students, both in FWCP and in GDPE. It's been fun to both commiserate and celebrate with all of you guys. And I want to thank my family, most of whom couldn't be here today, but some are, which is probably a good thing because I don't think, then even more of you guys wouldn't have a seat if all of them were here. And then lastly, but not least, I want to thank my lady friend, Sarah Jacobson, who not only read a lot of my drafts, but came out with me into the field and, talked through a lot of my research ideas with me. So yeah, with that, thank you all again for being here. I really appreciate it, and I'll take any questions. Sure.
Nice talking to you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So I was surprised that you didn't make a recommendation about mowing.
Yeah.
Why not?
No, I mean, I think that definitely could have been up here. Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually one of our cooler findings is that, this program reduces the amount of mowed vegetation, and further that seems to have an effect for at least some bird species. I think the fact that we saw more ground nesting species at these sites is probably somewhat related to that to some degree. So that could have been in here. Yes, that's a good point. I think that's definitely a recommendation, and that I think it's cool that I guess that such a simple management practice can have a huge implication for conservation and for bird species. So yes, that's a good recommendation. Yeah, John.
So if your goal kind of for a citizen science program, if your goal would be to change conservation attitudes, do you think that would come at the expense of data quality, or do you think you could kind of do both of those simultaneously?
Potentially, yeah. So this is, that's the trade-off, right? Potentially, if you reach out to some of these people who might not already be involved in conservation, they might have less experience with birds and might, be not as good at detecting them. I think really, though, what that goes back to is training. And so every program is going to be different. And if that is the model, if you really do want to change attitudes and have good data quality, you're just going to really have to focus on that training piece and maybe have extra sessions for, going out into the field and identifying birds and butterflies. So yeah, I think you would just have to adapt your program to fit those needs. But yeah, it's a good question. Justin, no, sorry.
So great job, Nico. Thank you. That was really excellent.
Thank you.
Thinking about your butterfly data, you mentioned there was a lot of variability across years. And
yes.
I'm wondering about the timing of the surveys that you might have done, considering that presumably most of the butterfly species you worked with were specialists on plants that have very different seasonal phenologies.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, I guess, if the timing of the surveys in a particular spot maybe happened to particularly catch or not catch butterfly species based on the time of the season.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so there's a lot there that I have to say about, but we monitored butterflies towards the last month and a half of summer, which I now recognize a more effective strategy if we really wanted to focus on butterflies would be monitoring for the entire summer, because we're missing a lot of butterflies when we do that. And that's one recommendation. If we really do want to focus on butterflies, that's one thing that I'd recommend because of the the phenology and the timing that you mentioned. It's not uncommon to see that variation across years. Butterflies tend to be a lot more variable across years than particularly birds. And in terms of the specialists versus kind of more generalist species, one thing about a lot of the species that we're, when we're monitoring, I guess, is they're adults, and at this point in their life history, a lot of them are really just looking for nectar sources. So they may be specialized in where they lay their eggs, but and where they're reproducing, but as adults, they're really just looking for nectar. So they're not as specialized when we're monitoring them. So a lot there, and I don't exactly know how all of that would translate into how we monitor, but yeah, there's a lot to think about there, I think. Good question. Bennett?
Great talking, Nico.
Thank you.
So for some of us who've been a part of urban ecological work, wildlife work, for example, like as a technician, sometimes if you're out in urban areas and parks or where people are out and about, exercising or what have you, you encounter a lot of the public, and people ask you, what are you doing? Why are you looking at the ground? Or what are you looking at in the trees? Do you think there's a component that you missed or that could be there, give a sense for either your technicians or your citizen scientists engaging other members of the public?
Oh, okay, I was thinking about that differently.
For that, do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so that's a very common part of researching around Fort Collins. I think particularly in Fort Collins, where if you're walking around with a butterfly net, everyone's like, oh, what are you doing? This is so exciting. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. There is some public outreach there. Definitely that we didn't capture here. I was actually, when you started asking that question, I was wondering if you meant in terms of data collection efficiency, which I suspect is probably pretty similar. I think both citizen scientists and technicians get asked those questions probably at a similar amount. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's an opportunity for public engagement, and that would be something that would be interesting to quantify, because that's honestly when I communicate a lot of these findings that's the medium through which I communicate them through, is during field work, telling people what I'm doing. Other questions? Sure, Danny. Thank you.
I was wondering if you've had specific recommendations about how to run your citizen science space.
Yeah, I mean, so currently the way that we do this, this is a big, you say citizen scientists, this is a big question in the citizen science community, is how do we reach new constituents with this model. And I think, particularly for this program, I can't speak to more generally, but for this program, the way that we really recruit our citizen scientists is, through posters on campus, and also, so emails that get sent out to the City of Fort Collins mailing list, and also just emailing past volunteers. And I think we can do all those things, but I also think we should make a more concerted effort to, actually, how do I say? I think it takes an active effort, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And we can't just use the existing networks that we have through the program. We have to kind of try to set up new networks in spaces that we don't currently, occupy, or with groups that we're not actually, connected with quite yet. So I don't know exactly what that would look like on the ground, but that's kind of the general idea of what I think we have to do. Yeah, Pris.
Very good job on the technical.
Thank you, Pris.
Just a clarification. When you were doing your analysis, did you consider all your sites as isolated, or did you consider the number and distance to adjacent green spaces as well?
So I tried to get at that idea with the landscape. So to answer the first part of the question, we assumed that they were isolated. However, what I tried to get at with the land cover, with including those land cover covariates in my regression models, was looking at if the amount of green space surrounding an area is, affecting any of what we're seeing, and if those relationships were significant or important. Any others? Sure. Oh.
In regards to the CNAP areas, so I live in an HOA that has one of these.
Cool.
And it's not much. It's like a small patch of what looks like non-native grasses and a small wetland. What's the variation in how active these areas are managed between HOA to HOA?
It varies a lot. So the landowner that I talked about is very, engaged with this, and that HOA in particular is very into this program and is very into providing habitat for wildlife. There are some that, one way that people get involved with the program is that they actually get a citation from the City of Fort Collins saying that, you have to cut your grass, or you could join this CNA program. So there are people that fall on that end of the spectrum too, who are just kind of fell into this program, and they're really just, in it for that reason. So it varies a lot, and I think, potentially the program can do a better job of, getting those HOAs that don't care as much, giving them some incentives, to care and to provide.
So as of now, there's no overarching guidelines or resources for all of them. It's just
there are if the landowners reach out, but it's not something. There's no really great structure, and there's for engaging those landowners in that way. And there are some assessments, but not as much as there could be, I think. Melissa.
Great work, Nico.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I think you even have more results than you did a month ago.
Yeah.
So I know that you studied open spaces and quote-unquote natural areas, but do you think that your results, you could make some recommendations also to residents of Fort Collins who actually, own a majority of the lands?
So just private landowners in general?
Yeah, all around those parks, right, if they're having some land.
Yeah, it's funny, after every talk that I've given about, this research, someone comes up to me and says, I have a plot of land, what do I do with it? I think particularly on the Front Range, there are a number of different programs that you can get involved with. I looked at the Certified Natural Areas program, but I also quickly mentioned the Habitat Heroes program that the Audubon runs. I think joining these programs is a really good way to do that, and to have some guiding principles for how to do that. But even if you don't want to be part of these programs, there are things you can do, like I said, like planting natives and kind of trying to create those gardens on your land. What was that? Yeah, potentially. Yeah.
All right, I think we're just about out of time, so let's thank Miko again for the talk.
Thank you.